You're losing control and you don't even realize it. Every scroll, every reaction, every moment you let your emotions decide your next move, you're handing power to forces that don't care about your growth. The world rewards those who can't be shaken, who move with intention while everyone else is swept along by impulse. That version of you exists, but only if you're willing to face what's holding you back. Self-control isn't about restriction. It's about reclaiming authority over the one domain you actually own, your own mind. Most people spend their lives being controlled by cravings they never examine, fears they never question, and habits they never chose consciously. They think they're free because they can do whatever they want, but they're slaves to every fleeting desire that crosses their awareness. The Stoics understood something radical. External freedom means nothing if you're internally imprisoned. You can have all the money, all the options, all the opportunities in the world, but if you can't sit with discomfort for 10 minutes without reaching for your phone, you're not free. You're just comfortable in your cage. Look at how you spent yesterday. How many decisions did you actually make versus how many just happened to you? You reached for food when you weren't hungry. You checked your phone when you were supposed to focus. You said yes when you meant no because silence felt too awkward. These aren't small things, they're evidence of a mind that's been outsourced to autopilot. The gap between who you are and who you could be isn't talent or luck. It's discipline applied to the moment right in front of you. That moment when anger rises and you have 3 seconds to choose your response. That moment when laziness whispers and you have to decide if today matters. That moment when fear shows up and you either step forward or step back. String enough of those moments together and you've built a completely different life. But here's what nobody tells you about self-control. It's not one big decision. It's 1,000 tiny ones that nobody sees. The battle isn't won when you finally quit the addiction or transform your body. It's won every single morning when you override the voice that says, stay in bed. It's won in the pause before you speak in anger. It's won when you feel the craving and simply observe it without obeying. Most people wait for motivation, for the perfect moment when discipline will feel easy. They're waiting forever. Motivation is a visitor that shows up occasionally. Discipline is the foundation you build brick by brick when motivation is nowhere to be found. You don't need to feel like doing the right thing. You just need to remember why it matters. Think about the person you admire most, not the highlight reel version, the real one. What makes them different isn't that life handed them better cards. It's that they learned to play their hand with precision. They trained themselves to act from principle when everyone else acts from emotion. They built an internal compass so strong that external chaos can't spin them around. This isn't about becoming robotic or emotionless. The Stoics felt deeply, they just refused to be controlled by what they felt. There's a massive difference between experiencing anger and being ruled by it, between noticing fear and letting it make your decisions, between wanting something and needing it so badly you'll compromise everything to get it. Your mind right now is like a garden that's been neglected. Weeds have taken over thoughts you never planted consciously. The work isn't to add more, it's to clear out what doesn't belong. To examine each thought pattern and ask, did I choose this or did it choose me? Does this serve my growth or just my comfort? The uncomfortable truth is that most of your suffering is self-inflicted through lack of awareness. You suffer because you believe every thought that crosses your mind. You suffer because you react to provocations you could simply ignore. You suffer because you've never learned to separate what happens from what you make it mean. Epictetus taught that we're disturbed not by events but by our views of events. Someone disrespects you, that's just data. Your interpretation, your reaction, your decision to carry that moment for the next 3 days, that's where the suffering actually lives, and that's where your power lives too. When you start practicing self-control, you'll notice something strange. The things that used to throw you off balance suddenly lose their grip, not because they changed, but because you stopped feeding them your energy. The comment that would have ruined your week barely registers. The craving that felt impossible to resist becomes just another passing sensation. This transformation doesn't happen through force. It happens through observation, through catching yourself in the act of losing control and choosing differently. Not perfectly, not every time, but more often than yesterday. That's the only metric that matters. Right now, you're standing at a fork. One path leads to more of the same, more reactivity, more being pushed around by impulses you never agreed to follow. The other path leads somewhere harder but infinitely more valuable. It leads to a version of you that can't be manipulated, that can't be thrown off course by every shift in circumstance. The question isn't whether you're capable of this level of self-mastery. You already know you are. The question is whether you're willing to start building it today, in the smallest decisions, in the moments nobody sees, because that's where everything begins. Not in the dramatic transformation you're imagining, but in the next choice you make after reading these words. The real work begins when no one's looking. Not in front of a mirror, not for an audience, but in the silent spaces where you're completely alone with yourself. That's where character is actually forged. Most people perform discipline. They wake up early when they've announced it to the world. They resist temptation when someone's watching. But strip away the witnesses and the performance crumbles. True self-control lives in the moments between visibility and invisibility, in the choices you make when absolutely nobody will know the difference except you. There's a specific kind of freedom that emerges when you stop negotiating with yourself. When the alarm goes off and there's no internal debate, just movement. When the craving hits and you don't entertain it, don't give it a platform to make its case. You just observe it, acknowledge it exists, and continue forward. This isn't suppression. Suppression is violent, forceful, exhausting. What we're talking about is something closer to sovereignty. You're not fighting yourself. You're simply no longer taking orders from every impulse that knocks on your door. Think about how much energy you waste in negotiation. Should I? Shouldn't I? Just this once. I'll start tomorrow. These internal arguments drain you before you even begin. Each negotiation is a tiny leak in your willpower. But when you establish clear boundaries with yourself, when certain things are simply non-negotiable, the conversation ends. You stop spending energy on decisions that don't deserve it. This creates space for what actually matters. The Stoics understood something most modern psychology is only now confirming. Your identity isn't fixed, it's built through repeated action. Every time you honor a commitment to yourself, even a small one, you reinforce a neural pathway that says, I am someone who keeps my word. Every time you break that commitment, you reinforce the opposite. You're not just choosing what to do in that moment. You're choosing who to become through accumulation. Here's what nobody tells you about building self-control. The beginning is brutal, not because the actions themselves are impossibly hard, but because you're working against years of conditioning. Your brain has learned that discomfort means stop, that boredom means switch, that resistance means quit. You've trained yourself to be reactive, to prioritize immediate relief over long-term alignment. Undoing that takes conscious, repeated effort. It feels like swimming upstream because you are, but there's a threshold. Keep pushing past the initial resistance and something shifts. The actions that felt forced start feeling natural. The discipline that required white-knuckle willpower becomes automatic. Not because you've become superhuman, but because you've rewired your default settings. You've made the hard choice enough times that it's no longer hard. It's just what you do. This is where most people quit. Right before the breakthrough. They feel the strain of those first weeks and assume it will always be this difficult. They don't realize they're in the hardest part, that if they just maintained pressure a little longer, the resistance would give way. So they retreat back to comfort, back to negotiation, back to the version of themselves they were trying to outgrow. And the cycle repeats. You have to get honest about what's actually stopping you. Usually it's not the thing itself. It's the story you tell yourself about the thing. I'm not a morning person. I don't have willpower. I've tried before and failed. These aren't truths. They're narratives you've accepted as truth because you've repeated them enough times. But narratives can be rewritten. The moment you catch yourself deploying one of these stories, you have a choice. You can let it run your life, or you can recognize it as outdated code that no longer serves you. Self-control at its deepest level is about reclaiming authorship of your own experience. Right now, if you're honest, you're being written by external forces. Algorithms decide what captures your attention. Social dynamics dictate your mood. Advertising shapes your desires. You're reactive, responsive, pulled in directions you never consciously chose. True mastery begins when you step out of that current and say, I will decide what gets my energy. I will choose what I become. This doesn't mean isolation or rigidity. It means clarity. When you know what you stand for, when you've defined your non-negotiables, you can engage with the world without being absorbed by it. You can scroll without losing 2 hours. You can be around temptation without giving in. You can hear criticism without crumbling. Because your center holds. Your sense of self isn't dependent on external validation or stimulation. It's rooted in something deeper, something you've built through daily practice. The paradox of self-control is that it actually increases your capacity for spontaneity and joy. When you're not constantly battling impulses, when you're not stuck in cycles of indulgence and regret, you free up enormous amounts of mental and emotional bandwidth. You can be present. You can appreciate moments without immediately needing to capture or consume them. You can feel without being controlled by feeling. This is what the ancients meant by freedom. Not doing whatever you want, but wanting only what aligns with your highest self. So the question becomes, what would change if you stopped negotiating? If you simply decided that certain standards were no longer up for debate? Not in a punishing way, not through shame or force, but through clear-eyed commitment to becoming someone you actually respect. Because that's what's at stake here. Not perfection, not some impossible standard of discipline, just the quiet dignity of being someone who keeps their word to themselves. And once you keep that word consistently, something shifts in how you see yourself. You stop feeling like a victim of circumstance. You stop blaming your environment, your history, your wiring. Instead, you recognize that every moment offers a choice, and you're the one making it. Not your past, not your mood. You. This is where most philosophical talk breaks down. It sounds good in theory, but when you're standing in your kitchen at midnight, exhausted, staring at the thing you promised yourself you wouldn't touch, theory doesn't help. What helps is having already made the decision, not in that moment, but weeks ago. You decided who you were going to be, and now you're just acting in alignment with that decision. The struggle isn't gone, but it's shorter. You feel the pull, acknowledge it, and move on. No drama, no internal war, just a quiet redirect. The Stoics understood that the mind is a garden. Whatever you allow to grow there will dominate the landscape. If you let weeds of distraction, justification, and impulse take root, they'll choke out everything else. But if you tend to that space daily, pulling what doesn't belong, watering what does, you cultivate clarity, and clarity makes self-control almost effortless. Because you're no longer fighting yourself, you're aligned. Think about the people you admire, the ones who seem unshaken, who move through life with intention. They're not superhuman. They've just made fewer compromises. They've built a life where their actions reflect their values, not their impulses. And that congruence creates a kind of inner peace that no amount of indulgence ever could. You can't buy that. You can't hack it. You earn it through repetition, through showing up even when no one's watching, through choosing the harder right over the easier wrong until it becomes reflex. But here's what no one tells you. Self-control isn't static. You don't achieve it once and then coast. It's a practice, not a destination. Some days will be easier than others. Some weeks you'll feel invincible. Others you'll barely hold the line. That's normal. The goal isn't perfection, it's direction. Are you moving toward the person you want to become, or are you drifting back toward old patterns? That's the only metric that matters. One of the most powerful tools in this practice is pre-commitment. You don't wait until the moment of temptation to decide what you'll do. You decide in advance. You set boundaries before you're tested. You create systems that make the right choice the default choice. This removes the burden of willpower in the heat of the moment. You're not relying on motivation or mood. You're relying on structure. And structure, when designed well, removes friction from the path you want to walk. Consider sleep. Most people negotiate with themselves every night. Just one more episode, just a few more minutes scrolling. They treat bedtime like a suggestion, not a commitment. Then they wonder why they're exhausted, why their focus is scattered, why their mood is fragile. But if you pre-commit, if you decide that your phone goes in another room at 10, that decision is already made. You're not debating it, you're just following through. Over time, that single choice compounds. Better sleep leads to better decisions. Better decisions lead to better outcomes. One disciplined choice creates a cascade. The same applies to what you consume, not just food, but information. If you scroll mindlessly for an hour every morning, you're setting the tone for your entire day. You're training your brain to seek distraction, to crave novelty, to avoid depth. But if you start your day with intention, with something that grounds you, whether that's reading, movement, or silence, you're building momentum in the right direction. Self-control isn't about restriction. It's about choosing what serves you over what simply stimulates you. Impulse wants immediacy. It doesn't care about consequences. It just wants relief, pleasure, distraction now. But you're not an impulsive creature. You're a thinking one. And thinking requires space. When you feel the urge to react, to indulge, to deviate, pause, even for 5 seconds. In that pause, you reclaim agency. You remember who you're trying to become. And often that's enough. The urge passes, not because you suppressed it, but because you didn't feed it. There's a concept in psychology called ego depletion, the idea that willpower is a finite resource that gets drained throughout the day. And while there's some truth to that, it's not the whole picture. Yes, decision fatigue is real. But self-control also builds capacity. The more you practice it, the stronger it gets. It's like a muscle. Overuse it without recovery and it fails. But train it consistently and it adapts, it grows. What felt impossible a year ago becomes manageable. What required intense focus becomes automatic. So where do you start? Not with a complete overhaul. That's a setup for failure. Start with one non-negotiable. One thing you will not compromise on, no matter what. Maybe it's your morning routine. Maybe it's how you speak to yourself. Maybe it's protecting the first hour of your day from digital noise. Whatever it is, make it sacred. Defend it. Not aggressively, but firmly. This is yours. And once that becomes solid, add another. Then another. You're not building a prison, you're building a foundation, and every stone you place makes the next one easier. The world will test you, it always does. There will be moments when giving in feels justified, when the cost of discipline feels too high. When no one would blame you for taking the easier path, but those are the moments that define you. Not because of what you do, but because of what you prove to yourself. That you can be trusted. That your word means something. That you're not controlled by circumstance. Self-control isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It operates in the quiet moments when no one's watching. When there's no reward waiting. When the only thing at stake is your integrity. That's where it lives. In the space between wanting and doing, between impulse and intention. Most people think discipline is about deprivation, about saying no to everything that feels good. But that's not it. Real self-control is about saying yes to your future self. It's about honoring the person you're becoming over the person you've been. And that shift, that mental reframe changes everything. Because suddenly passing on the distraction isn't sacrifice, it's investment. There's a reason the Stoics placed so much emphasis on this. They understood that external control is an illusion. You can't control outcomes. You can't control other people. You can't even control most of what happens to you. But you can control your response. You can control your choices. You can control whether you act from clarity or chaos. And in a world that constantly pulls at your attention, your energy, your peace, that control is everything. It's the difference between living reactively and living deliberately, between being shaped by circumstances and shaping your own path. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, not for publication but for himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wasn't speaking theoretically. He was reminding himself daily as Emperor of Rome, surrounded by pressure, politics, and chaos, that the only real power he had was internal. And he practiced it. Every single day. Not perfectly, but consistently. That's the key. Consistency over perfection. When you slip, when you break your own rule, when you give in to the impulse you swore you wouldn't, the instinct is to spiral, to say, "I already messed up, might as well keep going." That's the trap. One mistake doesn't erase progress. It's just data. It shows you where you're still vulnerable, where your system needs adjustment. But if you let one slip become a pattern, if you stop trying because you stumbled once, that's when real damage happens. Not from the slip itself, but from the story you tell about it. Self-control requires self-compassion. Not the kind that makes excuses, but the kind that acknowledges you're human. You're going to have weak moments. Everyone does. The difference is what you do next. Do you use it as evidence that you're undisciplined? Or do you use it as feedback to refine your approach? The strongest people aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who get back up without drama, without shame, without wasting time on self-pity. They just continue. Think about the people you admire most. Not celebrities or influencers, but the people in your life who have their act together. The ones who show up consistently, who keep their word, who seem unshaken by external chaos. What do they have that others don't? It's not willpower in the superhuman sense. It's structure. It's systems. It's the understanding that motivation is unreliable, but commitment isn't. They've removed the need to decide in the moment. They've pre-committed, and that removes friction. Friction is the enemy of consistency. Every time you have to make a decision, you spend energy. And if that decision happens when you're tired, stressed, or distracted, you're more likely to choose the path of least resistance. But if you've already decided, if the choice was made yesterday or last week or last month, you're just executing. There's no internal debate. You already know what you're doing. That's why routines work. Not because they're rigid, but because they reduce decision fatigue. They create guardrails that keep you on track without constant effort. The ancient Stoics had a practice called negative visualization. They would imagine losing what they valued most, not to be morbid, but to appreciate it more deeply. To remind themselves that everything is temporary. That concept applies here too. Imagine a version of yourself a year from now who didn't practice self-control, who gave in every time it was easier, who let impulse dictate direction. What does that person's life look like? How do they feel? What opportunities did they miss because they couldn't delay gratification or hold boundaries? Now imagine the opposite. Someone who practiced self-control not perfectly but persistently, who built the muscle slowly, who honored their commitments even when no one was watching. That version exists too, and the gap between them isn't luck, it's choice. Daily, unglamorous choice. You don't need to become a monk. You don't need to eliminate every pleasure or live in constant restraint. That's not sustainable, and it's not the goal. The goal is alignment, making sure your actions reflect your values, that the life you're living matches the one you say you want. Because if there's a gap, if you're constantly saying one thing and doing another, that dissonance creates suffering. Not external suffering, but internal. The kind that quietly erodes your self-trust until you stop believing your own promises. Self-control is how you close that gap. It's how you become someone you respect. Not through grand gestures, but through small, repeated acts of integrity. And over time, those acts compound. They build a foundation so solid that when life shakes, you don't. When temptation arrives, you're not interested. When pressure mounts, you stay steady. Not because you're special, but because you've trained for this. Because you've practiced in the quiet moments when it didn't seem to matter. And now, when it does, you're ready. So the question isn't whether you'll face moments that test your control. You will. The question is whether you'll have built the capacity to meet them. Whether you'll have done the work when no one was looking. Because that's where real strength is forged. In the unseen hours, in the private choices, in the moments when giving in would be easier, but you don't. Not because you have to prove anything, but because you've decided who you are. And that person doesn't compromise. That decision, that quiet commitment to yourself changes everything. Not overnight, not with fireworks or applause, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, you start to notice something. You walk differently. You speak with less hesitation. You make eye contact longer. Because when you know you've been keeping your word to yourself, you carry that knowledge everywhere. It becomes an invisible armor, not against the world, but against your own doubt. Most people underestimate how much power lies in private integrity. They think honor is something you display publicly, something performed for recognition. But the Stoics understood differently. True character is what you do when absolutely no one will ever know. When there's no reward, no witness, no external consequence. Just you and the choice. That's where you meet yourself honestly, and that's where transformation happens. Because every time you honor a commitment in private, you're casting a vote for the person you're becoming. You're saying, through action, this is who I am now. The world will test you constantly. It always has. People will misunderstand your boundaries. They'll interpret your discipline as judgment, your focus as coldness, your refusal to engage with chaos as arrogance. Let them. Because while they're busy interpreting, you're busy building. And what you're building, this inner fortress, this unshakable foundation, doesn't need their approval to stand. It stands because you built it correctly. One choice, one boundary, one act of self-control at a time. There's a strange paradox in self-control that most people never grasp. The more you practice it, the less you need it. Not because temptation disappears, but because your relationship with it changes. You stop seeing discipline as deprivation. You start seeing it as design. You're not restricting yourself, you're protecting something valuable. Your time, your energy, your peace. And once you realize that every yes to distraction is a no to what matters, the choices become obvious. Not easier, but clearer. Seneca once observed that we're not given a short life. We make it short by wasting much of it. And waste isn't always dramatic. It's not just addiction or collapse. Sometimes it's subtler. It's the slow leak of attention, the daily compromise, the pattern of choosing comfort over commitment. Those small concessions accumulate quietly until one day you look up and realize years have passed and you're still exactly where you were. Same struggles, same excuses, different date on the calendar, but it doesn't have to be that way. You can interrupt that pattern right now, not by overhauling everything at once, but by making one decision and keeping it. Just one. Choose something small enough that you can't talk yourself out of it, but significant enough that it matters. Maybe it's waking up when your alarm goes off instead of hitting snooze. Maybe it's finishing what you start before moving to the next thing. Maybe it's saying no to something you know depletes you. Whatever it is, make it specific. Make it yours. And then keep that promise for 7 days, not because 7 is magic, but because 7 days is long enough to feel the resistance and short enough to maintain focus. And once you've done it for 7 days, you'll have proof. Not theory, not hope, but evidence that you can control yourself when it counts. That evidence becomes the foundation for the next commitment, and the next. Until self-control isn't something you're trying to develop, it's something you've become. The Stoics never promised this would be comfortable. They promised it would be worth it, because comfort unchecked leads to softness, and softness over time leads to regret. Not the sharp regret of dramatic failure, but the quiet kind that whispers late at night when you're alone with your thoughts. The kind that asks, what could I have been if I'd just stayed the course? If I'd honored my word to myself? That's the regret worth avoiding. Not through perfection, but through persistence. You'll fall short sometimes. You'll break a commitment. You'll choose the easy path when you said you wouldn't. That's part of being human. But here's what matters. What you do next. Do you spiral into shame and use the failure as evidence that you're incapable? Or do you acknowledge it, learn from it, and return to your standard? The difference between those two responses is the difference between staying stuck and moving forward. Self-control isn't about never failing. It's about failing and choosing to begin again without the story. Because the story is what keeps people trapped. The narrative that says, I'm just not disciplined. I've never been good at this. I always give up. Those aren't truths. They're habits of thought. And like any habit, they can be replaced. You replace them the same way you build self-control, through repetition, through choosing a different thought, a different action, a different response, over and over until the new pattern becomes automatic. This is your life, not a rehearsal, not a rough draft, the actual thing. And every moment you spend waiting for the right time, the right feeling, the right circumstances, you're spending the only currency that matters. Time doesn't pause while you figure yourself out. It moves whether you're ready or not. So the question becomes simple. Will you move with intention, or will you drift? Will you build something that lasts, or will you keep starting over? The choice has always been yours. It still is. And it starts with the smallest act of self-control. Right now, not tomorrow, now. You already know what needs to happen. You've known for a while. The gap between where you are and where you want to be isn't a mystery. It's a choice you keep postponing. But every day you wait, you're not standing still. You're moving backward, because while you're deciding, everyone else is building. They're putting in the work you're thinking about. They're becoming the person you're planning to be. And time doesn't care about your intentions. Self-control isn't a trait you're born with or without. It's a skill you develop through practice, through showing up when you don't feel like it, through keeping promises no one else knows you made, through choosing your future over your comfort repeatedly until it becomes who you are. Not what you do, but who you are. That shift happens quietly in moments no one sees, but its effects are undeniable. The version of you that can't be ignored doesn't arrive through luck or talent. It arrives through discipline applied daily to the smallest choices. Because those choices aren't small, they're everything. They're the foundation of the life you're either building or watching slip away. So stop negotiating, stop waiting for motivation, start moving. The person you're meant to become is waiting on the other side of the work you keep avoiding.